So, hello everybody for the third panel. At the beginning of the third panel, we will have an extra point in our schedule. The letter from Evgenia Gubkina we were talking about in our introduction. She sent the letter, but it was lost in our mail server, which was down today of our Art Institute at the TU. But now we have the letter, so we will start the third letter that I will read the letter from Evgenia to you. Evgenia Gubkina, for those who haven't been with us in the beginning, she's an architect and architectural historian, originally based in Kharkiv and who had now to flee to Latvia with part of her family. And her work as an architectural historian is devoted to the legacy of the Soviet Union, so what's left of the Soviet Union, what was built in the time in the Ukraine. And also for those of you who haven't been there in the introduction, she will give a talk on that leftist heritage in the Ukraine, which is in danger now, on the 7th of April in the IG Architektur. We will send out invitations next week. So we'll start with a letter. There's my glasses. Dear participants of the second Claiming Spaces conference, in 2019 it was a different time. In my other, old reality, I was here in Vienna participating in the first Claiming Spaces conference. I gave a talk that my colleagues called a burnout speech, and I called it the dead architect speech. Through my personal story, I revealed a multidimensional aspect of the phenomenon of inequality and toxicity of some positive attitudes produced by liberal feminism. What is my reality today? Is it unseen? Definitely yes. I'm not here and you can't see me. My words are read by Inge. Instead of the role of a promising young scholar, I correspond to the role of a migrant or to the official status of a temporary refugee from a zone of military conflict. My reality is a war. No, this is not some kind of a local conflict. My reality is a full-scale, inhumane, massive war of a terrorist state aggressor against its former colony. My reality is thousands of missiles fired at civil infrastructure. All day shelling hit residential areas. My reality is thousands of people and hundreds of children killed. My reality is millions of people forced to leave their homes. My reality is a vastly destroyed home city of Kharkiv. For many years, I've been a guide of hundreds and thousands of people into this city. Most of my research and activist, architecture and restoration projects were related to this city. I wrote a book about this city and sent it to my publisher a month before the war. Its historical center, its heart, where the largest number of heritage sites of all styles and all periods is located, was ruined. Each fourth building has been destroyed. Heritage objects, including the Dashprom from the UNESCO tentative list, are in danger. This, along with other war crimes, could be defined and punished under the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. My world, my reality is destroyed, bombed, exterminated, erased, exploded, demolished, deconstructed, and killed along with my city of Kharkiv. Does this mean that the one who destroys heritage seizes memory? Does this mean that the one who captures ruins, exterminates space, he also appropriates history? Does it mean that the invader, by his tanks, occupies a territory, state, or people? Does the rapist possess a victim after an act of sexual penetration? No, no, and one more time, no. Why do we still have sympathy for the aggressor? Why do we still need to blame the victim? Give the victim the right to speak. Give the victim the right to be subjective and active. Give the victim the right to fight and take revenge. Let a new history be the history told by the victims. Let the new victims be full of power and energy. Let the victims build their own narrative. Help the victims capture discourse. And then you will see another history. Then you will see another reality. Reality where power of one victim is 1,000 times stronger than power of all missiles and nuclear bombs, of all armies, of all empires of the world. Down with imperialism, down with colonialism, down with Russian fascism. Sincerely yours, Evgenia Gubkina.
As we heard, Genia would have liked to bring up these issues of heritage, of destruction, and preservation, closely connected to the main question of our conference today. The panel, Unseen Realities, focuses on invisible work on authorship in the everyday life of architectural production. Whose realities? Whose histories? We want to critically question the structures and mechanisms that contribute to manifesting today's hegemonic realities in architectural practice and explore how different forms of cooperation can arise. We're now gonna present shortly our 4 speakers for the last panel. Firstly, Zaida Mushi is a specialist in urbanism, architecture, and gender, holding a PhD in architecture. She's been teaching as a professor of urbanism at the Barcelona Superior Technical School of Architecture since 2003. She has been working in advising and directing positions on inclusive urban and gender-related projects in cities such as Sao Paulo, Buenos Aires, and Santa Coloma de Gramenet in Catalonia. In 2005, she founded the collective Puncei for research and dissemination of urbanism projects with gender and feminist vision, and in 2015 co-founded the network One Day, One Architect for research and dissemination of female architects' work globally. Among several publications, her most recent one, Beyond the Threshold, Women, Houses and Cities, has just been translated into English.
Roberta Burghardt works as an architect and is co-founder of the architects cooperative coopdisco. She studied architecture at the Glasgow School of Art and the Berlin University of Technology. She has taught at various universities and participated in numerous exhibitions, among them Venice Architecture Biennale and Kunsthalle Exnergasse, Vienna. Roberta writes on the relationship between architecture and politics and has been engaged in various Right to the City initiatives, most recently the Rathausblock in Berlin-Kreuzberg.
Marisa Cortright is an independent writer, editor, and researcher based in Zagreb. Most recently, she has published Can This Be? Surely This Cannot Be. Architectural Workers Organizing in Europe, with the Viper Gallery in Prague. Previously, she contributed to the exhibition Safe Spaces, The Right to Space at the Arkham in Amsterdam, proposed the death of the calling on failed architecture, and convened fellow architect killjoys during the Architecture Fringe in Edinburgh.
The 4th speaker, Elke Krasny, is professor for art and education at the Academy of Fine Arts, Vienna. She is a feminist cultural theorist, urban researcher, curator, and author. Krasny's scholarship addresses questions of ecological and social justice at the present historical conjuncture with a focus on caring practices in architecture, urbanism, and contemporary art. Her forthcoming book, Living with an Infected Planet, COVID-19, Feminism and the Global Frontline of Care, develops the feminist perspective on imaginaries of war and realities of care in pandemic times. So we are very happy that you are here today with us. And we would like to hand over now. We will have 4 short introductions. And after that, we invite you for a discussion together with us and the public. Thank you.
Thank you very much for inviting me to this very interesting meeting. There are a lot of things to think and to learn about all the presentations. I'm going to speak shortly about who and what rights and what happened with women in the history of architecture, why we are not visible. And let me, oh, I couldn't see that. I have a problem. Sorry. Well, here. Okay, I'm going to read because it's better. As in other areas of knowledge, the arts, science, or politics, women have not been and are still not represented on equal terms, not even fairly based on equal merits. This is why it is so crucial to revisit the history of architecture and cities, rewriting it with women as its protagonists. This is no easy task, mainly due to the disappearing trace of women throughout history, writing according to values and standards that directly exclude women, as Petra says at the first group. If a scale of values is created through experience, everything outside of it remains unknown, denied, and forgotten. So, if it's the values and the experiences of men that by means of a patriarchal system establish what is worthy and notable, then half of humanity is sidelined and there is no place for other values, experiences, or knowledges. So it involves reading between the lines, weaving a new tapestry with these previously invisible threads, constantly questioning those values that are given as certain and irrefutable. Visibilizing and retelling from other experiences, allowing us to add to the already accepted history. Although in order to be able to add, we must know the value of each factor first. Only to show, also as professor, I have been the tutor of this work of Daniela Arias, where she proposed to analyze from a feminist perspective the mechanism that construct the narrative of history. And she shows how, who are the ones who write about, still now decide, write, and we saw some photograph about that at the beginning, but the women were present, obviously, were present in all moments of the history. As architect, as technician, and constructor, always we were there. So when the women are not in any field, something is wrong in the history they are telling. And also many times at the moment, the women are present, are recognized, but the problem is who writes the history also erase women from it. So we have to make invisible the invisible from a patriarchal perspective. It is crucial to change the perspective from which we observe ourselves and others, creating new ways of valuing both roles and activities that enable us to see and value women in all areas, including architecture and urban planning, both in the recognition, too often the revelation, of women's technical and intellectual contribution to safe professions, and in making visible the distinct needs of men and women in the city and the built environment. From different life realities come different experiences, and thus different data to approach the design solution of any project. I see at least two reasons to revise the historiography, the theory, the critique, and the practice of urban design and architecture from a feminist perspective. Two reasons that mean another way of doing, another way of seeing, another way of being. The first is to give a place in the history of architecture and urban planning on their own merits to the women who, before us and from a professional practice, whether official or not, contribute to the construction of our environments and knowledge base. To shine a light on the contribution that women from different experiences and fields of knowledge made to architecture and the city, placing the female experience at the foreground of knowledge. The second is the visualization of women's experiences and needs, insofar as women have been the notable absentees from the decision-making processes behind the building of our environments, in the hands of male experience and knowledge, mistakenly considered neutral and universal. Feminism, gender perspectives, and the defense of women as source of knowledge do not deny other conditions of subordination, such as social class, race, religion, or sexuality. However, the discrimination derived from being born a female is transversal and thus traverse and affects all other differences. It is important to recognize differences without it involving, by any means, the inequality seen to these days. And just to show a few references of the many works that we are seeing now in the world about revealing the presence of women in our field of knowledge, from this book, Breaking Grounds, that focus on 100 women or more classical architects. Union Arquitecta, that's it's a network of more than, I don't know, at least 100 academic person, especially in Latin America and Spain, but also in Italy and Portugal, where one of the main points of this network is to show that architecture, because this is another problem, is not only to build or design building. Architecture is really a broad profession, need broader knowledges. So in this network, we want to knowledge women that are profession from different point of view, professors, academics, researchers, builders, etc., and also designers, obviously. And from different networks, Laurie Brown and Karen Burns are working in this encyclopedia, global encyclopedia of women architects, and they have been working since a long time ago, because it's quite difficult to do that, but many networks of different places are working on this encyclopedia. And also I want to bring, because here we have a lot of examples of more Anglo-Saxon, German areas networks, but also Rebel Arquitecta in Italy, or Arquitectas Invisibles, Brasilia, o Soy Arquitecta in Buenos Aires, or La Zona Fem. It's a group of the women do. It's a group of the Colegio, of the professional association in Barcelona. So I think that what is different today from maybe 40, 50 years ago in the feminist movement, and especially in the area we are on, is that now the mean of production, for the worse and for bad or not, but the mean of production is not only in the hands of some powerful people. No? The network allows us to be in contact and to be able, our voice is listening from many places. So I hope that in this time, this ola, this wave, is not going to be disappear like the others waves that went before us. Thank you, and sorry by my English.
Roberta, yeah.
Good afternoon. Thanks for inviting me. I'm very delighted to speak here today. Like, there have been a lot of amazing presentations. Yeah, I'm going to talk about like a small case, and it's about actually an interview that has been published in an architectural magazine. But I don't want to scandalize this magazine or even the case. I think it's more that I think it shows something, like an experience that I've been having like on different occasions with how architecture is being presented and which stories are being told. And maybe the main message is that I find still architecture is super object focused, and I think this was also interesting in the panel before, like what is the relationship between the use of architecture and the physical objects? And like that's what I'm mostly interested in, is that relationship, because I can't think architecture without use and users. And this also has been my motivation for being like an activist, and that is very consciously also for me understood as architectural practice, not as professional practice, not as something where we earn our living with, that's something else, but still as architectural practice. And I've been engaged in a fight around a site in central Berlin, which used to be like a federal-owned site, owned by the federal government of Germany, because it used to be a former barracks in the 19th century, and it had like a lot of different uses in between. Hasn't been a barracks actually since the First World War, and the former user went bankrupt, and then the federal government tried to privatize it, and it was like one of the last large open sites in the very central district of Berlin-Kreuzberg. And a lot of initiatives have then campaigned against this privatization, and I was very active in one of the initiatives. And then, actually just last year, that was the first time that this whole case was represented in an architectural magazine. Like, of course, there were lots of other articles and a lot of other magazines and newspapers, but a representation in an architectural magazine, and I think this is important here. So, and I'm going to show pictures that were used to illustrate this interview, and then I'm going to show my own pictures, like to counterbalance maybe the narrative. So I hope that it works. Yes. So yeah, and this is actually the cover of that particular issue, and it's called Berlin Practice. And I think it's also a lot about the framing of this, like what is considered as a Berlin architectural practice and what not. And also I find this cover kind of telling, because you see this woman is pole dancing. Actually, I know her, like she's dancing really beautifully. But I think in a magazine where actually like a lot of the architecture with the big A, like the objects, are then again, like the guys are being represented here. I find this very problematic as a cover. And this is the first side of the article, and it's kind of really interesting because also the magazine chose this title, Planning as a Political Process. And here you can see that site, what we're talking about, this former barracks. What also shows, maybe you can't really see it, like on the left corner in this courtyard, there's like this architectural intervention that one other group proposed called the this is the design that won an architectural competition that was held by the city for that site, which actually also was the worst of all the competition entries, the worst one. And here you can see the plan, architectural plan. And here you can see like a drawing of this other proposal, the Baupalast, which is like more of like a design-build initiative. And it's not like that, nothing against that initiative, like don't get me wrong, it's just like what is being shown here and what not. And this is again, this proposal of the Baupalast collaged into other famous sites in Berlin. And this is maybe where there could be an intersection of stories. This is like one empty building, like a hall, like actually like a former production hall. That was, and here you can see traces of human activity. And this, yeah, like where like some of the things, maybe you can get an impression what like happening on that site. Which I need, yeah, there's like a few more sentences about that because, yeah, we campaigned against this privatization. Actually, we won. We won against fucking Wolfgang Schäuble. I don't know if you know him. He's like Mr. European austerity politics. And like he forced like all of Greece to privatize everything, basically. And but we not only fought against privatization, like from the beginning, I think one of our core narratives was, okay, like what could like a social development of the city look like which of course the main demand was affordability, like 100% affordability. So this is what we demanded. And what we managed, I don't know, probably have you heard about the Haus der Statistik, which is like another famous site in Berlin, like a modernist GDR, like huge complex, that is also now being transformed into like mixed use, social housing, the town hall of the Mitte district, and lots of cultural uses. But they also had, that was also owned by the same federal agency of real estate. And in the wake of the struggle around that site, actually it was possible to negotiate also the transfer of that site to the city. And what is kind of like interesting about these both sites is that the city actually in the end agreed on like implementing so-called model projects, which was kind of demanding. A model project was also kind of a tool that we strategically used, but it also now we see that the idea of a model project can also be very problematic because then it allows, yeah, you have your model project, we're doing everything, you know, but actually like our idea for like demanding a model project was more like, hey, like here we start a laboratory to invent tools that can be used throughout the city to transform, like, to deprivatize the city, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So in that respect, we haven't been that successful. But anyways, I think we have been successful in intervening into the discourse, at least. So, and how that looked like, I will show, like, a few pictures now. So this is another photo of the same thing, like, taken by me. And this is like an archive of banners and like action material. Yeah, and this was one of the many events that we held. Like, our big problem was that like the site was totally inaccessible because like they wouldn't, like it was completely, like, not completely, of course. That was not, there are a lot of small businesses with, from like car repair and stuff, but of course we couldn't use their spaces because they need them for their work. But otherwise it wasn't possible to get into any of these spaces. So it's very hard actually to mobilize when you don't have a space. So at one point we at least managed to get a garage. There's a lot of garages on these sites, which are really cool. Like it's also, I think, a great kind of a metaphor. And yeah, here we had a discussion on who's planning the planning. And yeah, this is like one of our many workshops we had, like about like how a model project could look like. And this was one of the many assemblies we had on the site. Oh yeah, I love this one. The development of like Metropolises only works with actions in the group, but still with autonomy. This was one of our first things we did because when they tried to privatize it, they had like these tours for investors, like to show them the site, and we knew when these were, and we always welcomed the investors with like things like this. Yeah, and also like this is in the bad picture, but this is in the town hall of Kreuzberg. Where also they had this information round for like investors, and we also managed to get in and annoy them. Yeah, and we had gardens. Like we let, like I don't know, we tried to be as much as possible on the site, and like. And there's also like a club there, and we got to know the owner of the club, and she also then allowed us to, or like cooperated with us, like having like meetings or like assemblies in the club, which was really great. And she also started to organize all the like mostly immigrant people of the car repair workshops. And yeah. And this was maybe also, we didn't talk about architectural design in the sense of how will this site look like in the future, but the important questions for us were like the fundamental questions. And one, of course, is the question of ownership of land. So, yeah, so, and yeah, and also actually this was a very, like 100%, this is like we operated with that a lot. Actually this was really successful because like it allowed us to talk with a lot of different people, but without getting compromised. So we even like talked to our political opponents, but because we had such a clear agenda, it was like always like productive somehow. Yeah, and yeah, 100% participation. Like we were constantly like present around the site, like leaving little visual traces, and yeah, and also bigger things like demonstrations. So, thank you.
Thank you, Roberta. That was invigorating. I don't have any slides, so I will just be coming to you straight ahead here. I want to return to first the title of the conference, Whose History? Because I think it brings us to the present moment and asking who's present as well, not only who's present in the room or who's present, is it in the sense of ownership, but also this sense of what's happening right now will be the future architectural history, and that we have the capacity to effectively shape what that's going to be, who is going to be the subject of future architectural histories. And I want to posit in my talk today the idea that one figure, and a quite crucial figure in our future architectural histories, might be the feminist architectural worker. That feminist architectural worker certainly knows what these unseen realities that our title, or the title of our panel, is speaking to. And they also might be the person who is best positioned to make those unseen realities seen, not only to people outside of the architectural industry who don't really have a good sense of what's going on, but also to those of us within the architectural industry who don't know what our peers are going through. I think that's been a common refrain today, particularly from the students of the TU Vienna. So my proposal then would be that this figure of the feminist architectural worker will be one of the figures that offers us a way to connect with people outside of architecture that will make these unseen realities, these struggles, the material conditions of what it means to be a student and a worker in architecture, both visible and legible and meaningful in some way to people outside of it. They might do that through connecting with broader struggles in social justice, from housing decommodification, or the public ownership of land, as we've just seen from Roberta, to prison and police abolition, to the rapid and just transition away from fossil fuel use. So I think these broad set of struggles are what the feminist architectural worker might allow us to connect into what we're doing simply within architecture. So I should backtrack and explain how I got to this figure, which I'm elaborating on for the first time in public today. I'm really realizing only just now how much of a mouthful it is to say feminist architectural worker. But FA doesn't really work, so I'll just keep saying it. I'll keep on. I suppose I've come up with the term because I am one. I was working for some time as overhead or a non-billable worker in a private architectural company in the Netherlands, which shall not be named. But suffice it to say that while I was working there and working in a particularly gendered role as someone in a communications department, not as an architect, I'm not trained as an architect, I found a number of things to complain about. And I thought, what am I going to do with this complaint? It's fine and well to, chit-chat with other people who are feeling the same way, particularly other people who are very close to you in your role, other women who are very close to you in your role. But I thought, well, we need to start doing something about this. We need to start organizing in some way. So one way I tried to do that for myself, which isn't organizing, I wouldn't say, I'll come back to that in a moment, but was to write an article to say, why is this not going well for me? How can I complain about all of my things in a public forum? And so in 2019, I wrote an article called Death to the Calling, A Job in Architecture is Still a Job. In that article, I proposed that there was this division in architectural workplaces between architects on the one hand and non-architects on the other. This is particularly prevalent in places that have, in private architectural companies, let's say, that have a lot of work abroad, particularly places in Northern Europe. I would say the Netherlands is up there, the UK, as well as to a lesser extent Germany, where they have a lot of people who are working in business development, PR, as accountants, as personal assistants. The list goes on, and you can recognize in these job titles a gendered kind of labor as well. So I wanted to bring this division to the forefront for all kinds of architectural workers, because I think it's important for us to understand that this division is preventing us from making progress on these complaints, from reaching a level above complaint that we might call organizing. And one culprit I identified in the article is this myth of the calling. I'm sure I don't need to explain it in great detail to anyone in architecture school, but effectively it's this idea that, yes, you are putting in these long hours, you're foregoing any kind of promise of great pay over the course of your career because you're so lucky to be an architect. You're following your dreams, you're gonna make a difference. We're coming back to the figure of the killjoy when I say I don't think that's the case. It's gonna really turn out that way for a lot of people, that it's going to be worth it, worth that sacrifice. The other thing that I think the calling suggests, particularly when we're talking about workers, is that not only are you called to be an architect in the sense of designing great buildings, but that it has this hope that you might one day own your own firm, that you might one day be the owner of the means of production, that you will be the boss of the architectural production. And for the vast, vast majority of architectural students, architectural workers, that's simply not the case. And so it's something that we have to grapple with when we're talking about labor organizing as well, because it really prevents this sense of architects in particular from being able to understand themselves as workers, of being able to recognize each other as, people who are in this subordinate position in terms of capitalist exploitation. So let's fast forward to 2021. I quit that job, I moved to Zagreb, and I got to work on my book. This is expanding a lot of the ideas that I wrote in this initial article, which I kind of put out and said, well, I've got to go back to work. I'll keep complaining with people. The pandemic raged on, and I thought, gosh, I got to get out of here. This is pretty bad. So I grabbed the first opportunity I could to just go sit in the sun in Croatia, and I organized myself to have all these interviews with different kinds of architectural workers across Europe, really expanding in this idea of architectural worker, not just people who are working in private architectural firms, but also people who are working for city governments, who are working in cultural organizations, and obviously also in academia, both as professors and as PhD students, which, as we've seen in London for the last, I don't know how many months, are definitely workers on the front lines as well. So what I tried to do in this book that I wasn't able to do in the article was really expand, who is an architectural worker? That's one. But two, offer this kind of olive branch for architects who can't see themselves as workers, who really struggle with that idea of identification. But as well, on the other hand, offer to people who don't identify as architects or who don't even really identify with the architectural industry, they maybe just see themselves as a worker, to say, hey, I actually do have some weight in terms of architectural production, how it happens, how it's going. And thirdly, what I really tried to bring to the fore is some Marxist analysis of the class relation inherent in this idea of the architectural worker. That really, it offers an understanding of the precarity of architectural workers, not as an architectural phenomenon, not as something with an architectural solution, but as something that is broadly the case for people in all kinds of industries everywhere. And that's really the strength of the term, that this is not something that architects are facing and suffering alone, but in common with other people. But how will they capitalize on that strength? And that's through organizing. So what do I mean when I say organizing? I'm going to read how I defined it in my book, since I've already written it. I've already written it down there, so I won't try to make it up again. But the way I described it is organizing as establishing and maintaining constructive outlets for critique alongside others who seek to redress injustice. Organizing as building collective knowledge and power through formal association and in nascent, covert, and loose formations. Organizing as documenting grievances and registering demands. Organizing as, quote, complaint, a path of more resistance, end quote. To organize is also to complain, quote, to become a container of negative affect, a leaky container, speaking out as spilling over, end quote. So to organize together as a, quote, complaint collective can be a support system, what we need, who we need to keep a complaint going, end quote. And all of those quotes are from Sarah Ahmed's latest book, Complaint. So this is almost, if we heard earlier from Brady Burroughs about Ahmed for architecture students, this is, Ahmed for architecture feminist killjoys already in the making. She comes back and back for me in thinking about complaint. I mentioned complaint as transcending into organizing, but really we can think of them as the same thing, in that they have this basis of a need for justice or a demand that they're making, and particularly from women, complaints are heard as demands. This is what Ahmed tells us. So I'll come back to her figure also of the feminist and the architectural killjoy to close on this figure of the feminist architectural worker, who I think is someone who is killing both the joy of feminists for they can't allow the goal of, let's say, the advancement of women in architecture simply to be something of representation, right? Without a class politics that's just kind of girl bossing for the sake of it. And they're also killing the joy of architects, for the goal of labor organizing in this case can't simply be to get paid more for doing the same projects, right? I mentioned earlier particular social justice struggles as housing decommodification, prison and police abolition, and climate justice. These have to be at the forefront of any feminist organizing as well, and therefore also feminist architectural worker organizing. Gosh, that's really a mouthful. So that's kind of where I want to close. I have more thoughts on this idea of the feminist architectural worker as doing the, let's say, social reproduction of architectural labor as well, but maybe we can hold that for the chat a little bit later. Thank you.
Okay, good afternoon. I don't like it up here. I know it already. In the Architecture Center, there's always light blinding you, and you don't see the wonderful people who are actually making the space, who are the social production of architecture. But we were invited to speak from here, so I'll do that. So I thank the organizers for inviting us, for bringing us together, and I'm really happy that we can be here in real space and share thoughts and controversies and conflicts, but also find alliances and hope. And I'm super happy that I could come. All my 3 children had COVID, but miraculously, I didn't catch it. So I felt like one of these people. Social reproduction was just mentioned, so I put food in front of 3 doors, and then I collected plates from in front of 3 doors, and we talked through the door. And I think all these things were already mentioned today. What does architecture do? How do we inhabit it? How does it allow for us to be protected? And how can that actually become part of a more feminist project of understanding architecture? So I guess I also don't have slides, as you may have noticed, and I will just share some thoughts and reflections and open-ended questions. I speak as an educator and as a curator and also as a person who writes. And I think I'm opening with the question, when we talk about whose history, what kind of feminism do we want to teach? And what kinds of feminisms do we have to teach in order for people to understand that there isn't just one kind of feminism? And that particularly in recent years, feminism has been co-opted by capitalism, as Nancy Fraser has written about most lucidly. And also there is a more recent co-option of feminist achievements, but also goals by the far right, and Sarah Ferris has written about that in her book, Femo-Nationalism. So I think we have to be much more careful and nuanced as to what feminist aspirations and goals and struggles are that we speak about. Zaida said before, women were present. And I think that's kind of, in a way, it's a demand to look, like what did they do? But I think we also need to look more carefully, what did they actually do? So even earlier in the morning, Lina Loos was mentioned, that she was actually influential in this still widely taught text, Ornament and Crime, which is one of the most racist texts within architecture we can think of. So I think it's also really important to think about the contributions that white feminists, and I'm not talking about the color of skin here, I'm talking about as an ideological construct, as white innocence by Elke was being analyzed. So I think one task for feminist architectural historians is to look at the implications and the implicatedness of feminism in a colonial, imperial, modern, etc., capitalist project. One of the other big questions we have to ask, what is actually architecture? Because so I'm not an architect, but we always already assume when we talk about the history of architecture that we actually know what we are talking about. So I think we actually have to think about the fact that the history of architecture is not the history of architects, even though they are important to the history of architecture. And also in the morning, this exhibition, the Museum of Modern Art exhibition, Architecture Without Architects by Rudowski was mentioned. And I think it has to do with something that is also very complex, because we assume that this is architecture without architects. Well, this architecture didn't just drop from heaven. I mean, it was made, it was produced, it was conceived of, it was designed, it was thought of. So there were definitely people who made it. So at some point in time, we think today that they were not architects, and they are anonymous. So this is all very complicated, I think. One important year to the formation of modern man as citizen and architect is the year of 1794, 1795, when the Paris École Polytechnique opened, and it's, as Ulrich Pfammatter has written in a book on the history of the modern architect, it was like a crucial moment for the formation of the architect. And we could say for the architect with capital A, producing architecture with capital A. And I think it also introduced this distinction between architecture as buildings and builders, so B follows the letter A, and A is more important. It also took 176 years for this Parisian institution to actually accept women. So it took them a very long time to understand that all kinds of bodies can actually be the ones who can think of architecture and produce it. So this is kind of the introduction. So the middle part, I want to state that I'm very interested in thinking about architecture as part of the history of consciousness and history of ideas. So how do these ideas become materialized? And I think there was a lot of talk about that earlier, how then people inhabit. And I would say that people inhabiting, but also cleaning buildings, taking care of them, facility managers, they're all architectural workers. So I would say inhabitation is a kind of work. It can be joy, it can be labor, it can be a burden, it can be all of that. But I think it has to be registered within what we call the history of architecture, which leads us to thinking about the history of architecture as a history of practices, materials, and technologies. And then I think we have to think about the actual objects which we call architecture and what we categorize as such and how they relate to feminism. So I think this is the, let's say, intellectual project I'm really interested in, to ask what is architecture in relation to a feminist project, more specifically in relation to an anti-fascist, decolonial, anti-capitalist project. And I'm not so much interested in what this architecture looks like. So I'm not looking for architecture that has breasts or something. I mean, that's fine, but it's not what I'm interested in. I don't think that the form equals the intent necessarily. So I think we have to ask the question, what does feminist architecture do? What does it enable people to do? How can they not be indebted? How can they actually stay there? There was talk about evictions before. So in order for feminist architecture to become a political project, it needs broader alliances than only architects, because they cannot do all this work by themselves. And I will conclude with what I've been working on, which is the relation between architecture and care. the exhibition that Angelika Fitz and myself did, and that was also shown here at the Architecture Center. Critical care was already mentioned. And I think one of the things to think about architecture and care that I want to bring to the conversation today is from the definition that Joan Tronto put forward. So Joan Tronto is a political theorist who works a lot on care. She has written a number of seminal books and essays, and she has like 4 steps. So she really talks about social reproduction, healthcare. She talks about care narrowly understood. And she says we care about things. So we feel about them, and we feel strongly. And then the next step is to care for, so that they actually get done. And then we have the care giving and the care receiving, and that is more reciprocal than maybe assumed. And then she also more recently has started to speak about caring with, so that caring is not done alone. And I think what I'm interested in is vis-a-vis architecture, how does what we care about is actually aligned with what we care for? So how do we get from here to there? So that what we care about is not just something that we speak about or that we dream of, although that's very important to speak and to dream. I do not want to diminish it. But how do we get to the actual realities of it? How do we actually care for it? And I think I may not need 8 minutes because I think I already shared what I wanted to say. And I hope that we can use the time fruitfully for discussion at the panel, but also with the audience.
Thank you so much to all 4 of you. We'll now invite you to come up on stage with us so we can have a little bit of a discussion. So we had very different fields and still a lot of overlapping topics and interests. I would like to start with a question. We had heard a lot about the feminist architectural worker, and Elke, you just also talked about the fact that inhabitation is also kind of a work. So what is a feminist architectural worker? It's a huge theme. And one question would be, what can a feminist architectural worker in all these meanings do to change the way the work is done, the way we build, the working together on a maybe broader scale than just the representation? We heard about organizing, about protest, about networking, and I would like to hear maybe a little more of your thoughts on this question. Whoever wants to start grabs the mic.
Okay. I think that I agree with Elke that this is not a form, no? And I think that there are way of doing and way of relating each other. But we couldn't think that we are special. But I think that the feminism proposed a different way of working together. And in this case, architecture is not different from other things in life. I think that this is important because many times in the history of architecture, we forgot the person and we only see the hero. And I think that it's very important to be the same outside and inside the profession.
Can I say something? So I didn't want to take the word away from you. I mean, I really think it's wonderful that you gave this idea of the feminist architectural worker to people to think with or to run with. I guess it builds a lot on the work of Peggy Dima, who has written about capitalism and labor within architecture, and also introduced the idea or the notion that we can actually think about labor conditions within architecture. So I think there's a kind of a distinction to be made between what does it mean to actually be a professional? Like, I would say there's a distinction between professional feminist architectural worker working in an architectural office or as part of urban government, or as part of a developer or a construction firm. So I think this is one part to think about that and how they could organize. And then I think there are architectural workers that have to do with other things that architecture needs. So once architecture has been built, it's nothing on its own. I mean, it needs us, the humans, to take care of it. So there are cleaners and facility managers and people inhabiting and maybe heritage workers, or there's all kinds of people who actually deal with architecture. And I think there are also architectural workers, knowledge workers, we could say, architecture historians. So I would just like to broadly distinguish those two in order to ask how can they collaborate. So they are different vis-a-vis the production, because some produce something that will be there in the future and others take care of what's already there. But how do they come together? I think that's one of the big questions. And I'm looking at you because you introduced the feminist architectural worker to us, but of course it's a question for all of us to think about.
Sure. Can I table that for a moment? It's a big one to grapple with. Let me set it aside for a second, because I want to return maybe to an experience I had that I think gets to the original question from the moderation. So in the unnamed architectural company in which I worked, there was some diversity initiative, shall we say. And when myself and other people who were working on that initiative tried to bring, let's say, the concerns of people who were giving us input, and they said, oh, well, we need to pay interns more. We need to make sure that the interns are housed securely and have enough money to live in this expensive place. They said, oh, no, that's not relevant to this diversity initiative. That's something that we should talk about with the Works Council, which is effectively a kind of group that is supposed to be comprised of workers in a company and kind of advise the board of directors on how they should proceed with decision-making regarding material conditions of their labor. And so there was this division from the head of the company between what was considered to be, I think, wrongly a feminist idea, in the sense of there are many different feminisms, some of them are not very helpful, and this idea of distinguishing, talking about interns' pay as a workers' council issue rather than something that would be important for our diversity initiative really strikes at the heart of that. So I think one answer would be insisting on the fact that these are one and the same struggle, and that they must be considered as one.
Maybe I would like to add that the material reality of the architectural practice forces us to be really competitive, like competing around commissions, professorships, jobs, whatever. And I think, that notion of the architectural worker would mean for me to find ways to, at least maybe for some moments, to cross that logic and in cooperating and also understanding. I mean, this is like the how Elke already laid out so wonderfully. Like architecture is such a collective endeavor. I mean, there's so many fucking people involved in creating architecture, and then there's always this even the film industry is better in showing that. Also, there's always the big film maker or but still you have everyone named, but like you never see when there's a building published, you never see this long list of, you know, people being involved in it. And I think this is like, for me, like this is at the core also of like thinking of like a feminist practice, like acknowledging that and like putting like a value in all of these different tasks that are necessary to create architecture and to build a solidarity through that.
And then maybe we also, we heard a lot in we talked about it in the preparation already, and we heard it a lot today, that this idea that one can't think architecture without the use or the users, and also what happens in a space is as important as the physical qualities of the space, like how it looks like, how it feels like, how it's going to be used, how it's going to be lived for the users. And so one following question would be, how do you implement this in your own work, adding an intersectional feminist layer? And how does this kind of work, or this even consideration idea that you would put into your work, meets obstacles like financial recognition, legitimacy, and how do you deal with it?
Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah, I think maybe that also relates to that kind of conflict that I see in this representation I was speaking about earlier, because also like what us as a practice, actually what we did in the past years, we also did like a lot of studies for the municipalities and like producing policy papers on like equitable development of the city and participation and all these topics. And then you feel like, yeah, it's all beautiful what we write down there, but in the end of the day, you produce it for the drawer, because you know that the existing power structures like just don't allow like for like even basic things to be implemented. And even though you even try to think like we're not naive, even if we write these policy papers, we try to take that into account, but still like, I don't know, like actually like, although it's great that we managed to prevent this privatization in this one case, I'm about the situation in Berlin, I must say, with like all these huge challenges about like social injustice and climate change that we're facing, I'm quite disillusioned, I must say, about like trying to change things from the municipal level, because that was also a lot in our work, like a theory that actually the municipal level is actually where you have some agency instead of like the national level or even the super whatever, you know. But like, okay, this is local, this is graspable, and you know the people, and still like you know, even though we with this anti-privatization protest, we were doing like federal politics because the land was owned, and actually, yeah, so there were all these involvements, but still like even the government still has the same colors in Berlin than the past 4 years. But in terms of the politics, what's being proposed, it's really like just stepping back, and like just this kind of very classic concrete politics of big developers. These are the ones that are going to save us, that pour as much concrete as possible everywhere. This is the solution. So, yeah. Yeah, so like our strategy as a firm is basically finding other clients, building up other client structures, and then like, yeah, you realize very fast, oh, actually you have to go into development, you have to become a developer, and then, you know, this is even like, also like fucking patriarchal field. So, it's, I think, but at least making these things visible, I think for now this is an important part of our work. But when it comes to architectural commissions, it's actually like quite difficult.
I think that I'm thinking more from the academic of Professor Borg, I try to open a way of working more horizontal with my mates, but also with the students, obviously, showing in some way a not hierarchic relationship. Also, if you are telling history, not the heroic figures, but trying to understand what, where, and because of the why of the things, and also inviting them to make questions, to think about the projects, etc., and that not everything need to be done, and for who, for what, where, and trying to open a place for own thoughts and own position, no? Because as I have almost 300 students in the theoretical classes, you couldn't obviously give only one option. No? You have to open to their own discovery of the way to work.
I'll take a stab at it. I've been trying to think of how to reply to this question as someone who doesn't maybe have a lot of power, particularly as a individual worker, say, in a much bigger company. But I suppose it gets to this question of when can you refuse to do something at some point? This is maybe one small thing that you have an opportunity to deploy, perhaps as a mechanism to say, look, this is actually really where we have to draw the line. There are a lot of things that you can't draw the line at, that you have to kind of go along with, but you have to know when, I guess, to pick your battles. So I'll share one project that I said, no, this isn't going to happen. At the end of 2018, the city of Miami released a request for proposals, basically asking architecture companies and engineering firms, et cetera, to reply and say, we're prepared to take on this project for a new police department headquarters that they wanted to be the equivalent for the city of Miami as the Empire State Building was for the city of New York, which sounds like an Onion article or something. It's ridiculous, but this is a real thing that the city of Miami put out. And the director at my employer writes me and says, will you please put together this request for proposals? And I thought, no, no, certainly not. Not only is this not something that the company I work for is maybe well positioned to win, which is part of my job to maybe screen and say, look, okay, we could do this, but maybe we couldn't do this, we're not so competitive for that. But no one should be doing this project, right? And I think that's where you're ultimately trying to get, is this idea of your own refusal is not simply because you don't want to do it, but because it shouldn't be done. And that's also where the organizing then comes in, because I started to think ahead and say, well, if I'm not going to do it, are they going to ask someone else to do it? And then what if we end up doing it and then we win the project and then the architects have to, right? So it goes on, and you wonder, how will you deploy your organization such that you can use your refusal so it stops? And you could apply the same idea, the same thought of, okay, I could say something, but it might not do anything, to any number of other things. I think this gets back to Sir Ahmed and complaint, sexual harassment in universities, you name it. But that's just one particularly glaring example because it's a building that shouldn't exist. Fortunately, the city of Miami canceled this for unknown reasons. Maybe they were called out for the bad idea, but I'll leave it there for that example.
I think I was thinking about something similar along these lines. So when one works, so I work as a teacher, so when one works with students, how does one think about what to say no to? I mean, so how to think about to refuse the delivery of services, which is very similar to what you were speaking about. So how to understand who the client is and how to refuse to build for petrocapitalists, warlords, oligarchs, you name them. So, and I think this is also where something that you said before comes in. So if one person says no, it's pretty irrelevant. Mm-hmm. If all the architectural service delivery people, normally called architects, say no, it's quite different, because then this world, as we know it, is not going to be built in the same way. So I think this is what, in a way, comes from what you were just saying. So how to take down competitions or unsavory clients, if you will. The other thing I was thinking about is how, and I think that was also spoken about in the preceding panel, is so inhabitation is not only, I would say, the social reproduction labor, but it's also the emotional, affective, intellectual reproduction. And this comes to the history of uses and counter-uses. I mean, living in Europe, we mostly live in buildings that have very toxic histories. So they're implicated, and I'm not talking about ecological toxicity here, but that's also, of course, important. But I was more thinking about colonial histories, fascist histories, authoritarian histories. So the buildings are there already when we are born and move into them. And so one obligation, I would say, within architectural history is to learn what these buildings were used for, so who used them for powerful purposes, but also what were the counter-uses and how do we live with the knowledge of implicatedness, but also the possibility of using buildings against what they were actually meant to be used for. And I think that's a huge field within architectural history, and I think normally it's not even understood as a field within architectural history, narrowly speaking. And I guess that's something where, like Françoise Vergès, she speaks of multidimensional feminism in her book, Decolonial Feminism. So we could say when we read these theories, we can put them into practice as spatial and architectural investigations in order to understand past buildings. And I think the other thing we can do is to think about the future, as we were talking about before. So what is it that we do not agree with and have to become better organized in order to not let it happen?
So before we continue with our questions, maybe there is already one in the audience.
Hello, thank you. I'm really enjoying your conversations. I can also relate to the feminist architecture worker term, or the figure. And my question is actually to all of you, if you may like somehow dream or imagine, if we all agree on what this term, what this role actually means and what the demands are, but in your own way, if you can dream, if the feminist architecture workers get their voices and can communicate it, how then the architectural field itself will shift or would shift in and meaning like not only the process or outcomes, or maybe also like in a matter of representation and the communication towards the other world. So I hope this was like understandable. Yeah, thank you.
I heard interesting from Elke and yes from Marisa. You want to start or?
Sure. No. Maybe one outcome of that dream scenario, that ideal scenario, would be a lessening of this distinction that Roberta made earlier between architectural practice and professional practice, where in professional practice, as I understood it, at least you can correct me if I misunderstood, was paying the bills. It's what you have to do to kind of make sure everything else is running okay. And our architectural practice could be something much broader than that. It might include professional practice, but it also, as in your case, would include activism or political engagement in other ways. So I would like to imagine that this feminist architectural worker of the future, or possibly today, would not necessarily need for those things to be so different. I think you also have to imagine some broader societal change that happens where architectural workers in general are not so precarious, because I think that precarity demands this distinction between how we pay the bills and then what we do that we're actually interested in. They're so different for so many people right now. And I think in order for us to reach that dreamland, those things would need to come closer together such that our material needs don't have to be met in a completely different way than the things that we actually want to do. Maybe that's not necessarily saying all of our jobs are great and we're getting paid a fair wage, but the state provides us money so that we can engage in whatever it is. Or you could imagine a number of scenarios where the precarity just isn't there, right? I think that's the crux of it.
Yeah, I don't know if I'm referring directly to your question or if I'm just continuing the conversation here. I think I want to pick up like the question of the client again, because usually like that's the problem. Like I mean, to use like these big terms, like probably like 99% of the clients we would like to work for can't afford us. I mean, I think that's like the core problem. Like, and even though like there's some public housing schemes, but then like there are these problems that have been addressed before, then you're like you still don't work with the users. Then you usually work with some, I don't know, intermediary like city council, public housing bodies, whatever, and then you're like faced with these norms and gender norms and blah blah blah. So and I think this is like, I think this needs to get more in the forefront of like architecture or in the discussion or even the teaching. Like I mean, in a way, us as a practice, we try something that is very luxurious. Like we try not to work for toxic clients, but it comes with a high price. And it's like, and I know it's a luxury like that many people can't afford, especially if you come like from a precarious background studying architecture. So I don't want to be like high-nosed about it. So I mean, this is something we try, and I think it's worth trying it, and it's also worth like talking about it and showing the problems. But it's like, but it's not about like standing on a higher moral ground. I think this is super important. I think also this is where your term of the architectural worker becomes so valuable, because then it becomes again like to have not an idealist but a materialist understanding of the architectural practice.
I would like to think that architecture is the future of feminist architecture practice is not only for the ones who could pay for it much money, but as a service, a facilitator, as a service to help people to live better. And there are some options, some examples of this kind of profession. Obviously, it's not easy because it's difficult to get paid to live, because you also have to live. But I think that for me, I would like to dream in a profession that really help people to have better life, and maybe some kind of, it's not family doctors, or it's not the same, or cooperatives that works with people to really facilitate the decisions, because usually people know how to live, but they see us as a very superfluous profession, and only for rich people. And I think that we have to demonstrate that we can help society to live better, and also not only people but also other livings, the earth and the animals and the plants, etc.
I think it was a really interesting question, and I would like to return to that, because I imagine you asked this question to someone. So when you learn that someone is an architect, would you ask this person, and how do you want to become a feminist architectural worker now? So I think posing the question like this to someone who has maybe never thought about becoming a feminist architectural worker before would maybe, so on a one-to-one level, but also on a larger level, elicit very interesting responses, because you also asked how would that be defined, and I think so if we talk about this in the sense of it has to become feminist, but it also has to result in something that has to do with architecture, then the answer is not in the definition. The answer is in the practice. And so I guess it's really, that's why I said it's such a super interesting question you asked. And I think starting off a semester with the question, so, you think you will become architects, but what would you do if you wanted to become feminist architectural workers? Where would you study? How would you train? How would you prepare? How would you organize? So all the things we were talking about. And so I think this is really a fantastic question. I will definitely use it in the future.
So is there a possibility to give a suggestion to these students who want to work like that?
One tip you'd give to each of them.
I think I already said that, working in a different way and being more aware of really the real necessities of people and planet, and trying to work in a respectful way to the others, but also to the client and to the planet, etc. I think that it seems a little thing, but I think it is the real change for the future. It is consciousness of eco-dependency and interdependency that are the key words for the future.
I would add organization, like organizing people, organizing yourself with others, not only like also with architects, but of course not only, but also with all the other architectural workers and also the users. I think, and I think this is what annoyed me the most with that interview, that a lot of the work we did over this past 10 years was just organizing people, like getting people together and creating a voice. And that this, especially, that this aspect has become is so invisible and so not, it's somehow totally outside the architectural discourse, I think, as a spatial practice. And and I think this is also like something very material, like organizing around material things. I mean, housing would be like one example, but it also could be like other kind of like social spaces, safe spaces, whatever. I think it is like space is so material, and we so need it, and there's so much lack of space for the most vulnerable people, and I think this is. This is like a suggestion I would make for the feminist architectural worker. Get organized.
I'll grab this one, but thanks. I second that wholeheartedly, and I suppose I would return to my my proposal that we kill the calling, that we have this death to the calling. I think that would actually be a precursor to even being able to identify as a feminist architectural worker, that you first kill the joy within yourself. I think that's how Sarah Ahmed puts it, at least in terms of the feminist killjoy, that you kind of have to bring your own expectations down before you're able to make demands or have expectations of others. And that goes doubly true here for both the architect part of you that you need to kill the joy of and the feminist part of you that you need to kill the joy of. You have to embrace it because it's going to come sooner or later, and the sooner you get it over with, though, you're on the other side.
So I think I want to give a slightly practical answer to this, I'm not saying this is not practical, what you were saying. I'm just saying, I think, so within teaching, I guess we all know that architecture really costs a lot of money and a lot of resources, and it's very dependent upon systems like politics and economy/business. And I would say what I don't see in architecture schools so much is that there is actually an interdisciplinary exchange with feminist economists or with feminist political theorists, to understand better how the economy works and what other models of non-heterodox, like diverse models of economy there are. So I think this is something that I would see in very practical terms. So to learn differently in order to also understand what it is that architecture builds. I mean, what is the concrete mafia? What do they actually build in this world? How do they operate? So I think there's more knowledge needed in order to do things differently. And then I would say maybe for every architecture student, feminist bootcamp, where you actually read texts, like relevant feminist texts. For example, Rafia Zakaria Against White Feminism, where she talks about deconstructing feminism and reconstructing it again. So I would say also as people teaching, one would need to educate oneself all the time, together with those with whom one works, and to learn from one's students and with one's students, because they have enormous, I mean, I'm only speaking from experience, they have enormous knowledge, and one has to acknowledge the knowledge they have in order to build differently, not physically build only, but to build differently in intellectual and terms and in terms of consciousness. And that comes back to what you were saying about transversality in the classroom. I mean, how to have a different feminist pedagogy in working together.
Maybe we can bring another question.
Yes.
My question, maybe I'm a bit late now because it was from a while ago, but yeah, I'm also kind of intrigued by the idea of the feminist architectural worker, and this is something that, yeah, the vocation or the calling exists in many disciplines or in many fields, in art, in architecture, in filmmaking, in fashion, in nursing, in teaching, and in all of these areas. Why is it useful to define why is it useful to do the inquiry in architecture? I mean, I can see why it's important to address the conditions of architecture on their own terms and precisely in order to do organizing. But in your book, obviously, like, capitalism treats all workers more or less like it flattens the kind of distinction. So I'm just curious, in your analysis or in your theorization, how you see this. And then because I'm thinking of the work of Marina Wischmidt and Kerstin Stackemeyer in their book in relation to art, which is, much of their work, which is addressing questions of reproduction or feminist histories of social reproduction, and the distinction between like a kind of affirming the worker or even kind of going in the other direction and trying to negate this. Obviously, you're also talking about refusal, but does the architectural worker have to is it a kind of revival of the union and the kind of mass strike, or is it a kind of, is the horizon different, and is it a kind of what? Yeah. So I'm just kind of curious about, because you said complaint, and you also said refusal, but these are not. It's not strike, which is something. This is a kind of action that is still, important and happening today, like you mentioned in London. I mean, in universities, all the universities in London or in the whole of the UK, many of them have been on strike because this sector has been destroyed. So I'm just curious, why complaint makes me think of a kind of, something you do to the human. You kind of. It's a very. It's a weak kind of act. Maybe so I'm just curious, yeah, if you could say something about that. Thanks.
Let's see. I think Sarah Ahmed would disagree with you about complaint being a weak act, but let me set that aside to come back to, I guess, the initial part of your question, which I think is relating to why distinguish architectural workers as having this particular calling versus maybe other kinds of workers who are subject to a calling in a similar way, or even why distinguish architectural workers at all from other kinds of workers. Is that right? Yeah, I think part of it is, and this is simply my experience as having worked as an architectural worker in the architectural industry for a while, is that because of the insularity, it's hard to maybe get architectural workers' attention if you don't say this is about architecture. I mean, we're at an architecture conference right now, so maybe that's a case in point. But I think I grapple with this question of the insularity in the book, which is to say, okay, I've got your attention, we're talking about architectural workers, you have all of these issues. They are like many of the issues of workers in other industries, including, as you mentioned, that the calling does not exclusively affect architects. That's certainly the case, I agree with you. I think it's like, where do you go from there once you've identified that both, yes, there are these things that apply to you, they do apply to other workers, why should you care about this in particular? I think that's really the line that I was straddling throughout the course of the book, which I conclude really by saying, you have to organize beyond the idea of architecture. And this is why I mentioned in my talk a couple of these other currents of social justice struggles that people might be attracted to, because they so immediately touch on the immediate, let's say, conditions of architectural workers in terms of how they live themselves and also the projects that they have to work on. So that could be one way that architectural workers in particular find an entry point into this broader idea of understanding themselves as workers, even if they're not as precarious as, you know, having tens of thousands of dollars or euros or pounds of student debt, and even if they can make rent and they're fine, they still might be troubled by the fact that they're asked to design a prison, right? So that could be an entry point in a different way than other kinds of cultural workers who are not actually producing the you know, carceral architecture, right? I don't think that's exclusively specific to architectural workers, but I think that's one path I try to lay out in the book to say, we could get your attention in this way. Yeah, I'll leave that there.
So I think we have another question. Oh, we have a few other questions, as I see.
It's okay. Thank you very much for the great discussion. I was just wondering if we talk about the feminist architecture worker, and then also what Elke Krasny said on the division, the academization of the profession, or professionalization. And I don't know, maybe I just didn't get it right, but we tend to find much more connections to theory and art, while I wonder if we should not start thinking and connecting to the feminist builder, to the actual labor that is closest to our profession.
Maybe I try to answer. I mean, maybe it's also like tied into the question of the architectural worker, because one problem is still like, I mean, like that. I think that is like one of the contradictions also, like that the architectural worker, like the concept one has to deal with, because it still is like the field of architecture as like, as it is, the self-image as it is being reproduced is still a largely super elitist one. And as it was also mentioned earlier, like those like successful architects, not all of them, but most of them come from wealthy backgrounds. I mean, actually that's what they share with art workers. And I think this elitism is also like something that is in the way, it is in a way, because it is in the way of like other alliances and thinking about like actually, yeah, because actually like it's really good to also to fraternize with the builder against the client, for example. like depend on the client, but like, you know, like but you can also think it like this, you know, we're also always like being thought of like, yeah, we are like these service people, like in service of the clients, and we lick the client's ass. And this is what we are being taught, and also like all this like self-expression and like self-realization that's like at the core of like many creative industries. But like, yeah, but I think also I think there's a lot of like innovation is happening like on the construction site, like with the builders, with the people that manually make the things. So I think it's as well as what you just mentioned, like the questions of economy, you know, like what are the economies behind architecture and what different kind of economies would be perceivable. So also, and that what it should lead to have different social relations in the production of architecture. And is that possible under the broad frame of architecture? Can we build pockets where we do it differently? Like, yeah, these are very interesting questions, I think.
You want to say something, or should we ask another question?
I mean, I think the two questions that were just asked, they're actually, in a way, maybe linked to each other. So why is it of relevance to distinguish between, let's say, fashion workers, architecture workers, art workers, and so on workers? And I think one interesting way of looking at this is that if we take a textile object or an artwork or a piece of architecture like a building, and we understand all the people who have been involved in its production, so the ones in the, let's say, who produced the material and the ones who designed, and how they would organize. So I think if we don't look just at the profession, but from the actual object and think that as a political object around which to organize the conditions of labor along all the people involved, then I think it's actually a very interesting proposition. So to think the architectural, and that's what I tried to say before, the architectural worker along these different distinctions, so the real professional field, professional, like architectural offices, but also all the others. And it's not that they are not professional, but they're not considered the profession of architecture. And so organizing around specific objects can also be much easier than thinking of the International League of Feminist Architecture Workers globally, and until we get them off the ground, we are all dead. So I think that making it very concrete, that's something I find very attractive in this question. And then this would also come back to the question of how to actually create alliances with builders, facility managers, cleaners, so all the ones who are actually physically really involved in buildings and have deep and profound knowledge how architecture operates in daily life and what it needs. The other thing I was thinking about is maybe there are distinctions. I mean, architecture is maybe more implicated in what we call building the system and producing objects that, I mean, I'm saying this with a caveat, but on a certain level they may be more needed than art at certain moments. And I think this is something that might that implicates architecture in a different way, because the needs are different, the physical needs, how we reproduce as human beings through architecture within it. So, I mean, I would have to think more about that to answer that, and to relate Starkemeyer's and Wischmidt's work to the question of architecture, which they don't write about, but I think it would be an interesting exercise to do.
We are running out of time, but is there any question in the chat?
Yes, so we have two questions from our live chat. And the first one is from Julia Wannenmacher, and I will read it out aloud. So she asks, the stereotypical idea of an architect and the calling, in parentheses, has been mentioned several times today. So how can those images nowadays be actively deconstructed? And what comes after that deconstruction? And maybe I will add the second question, which is from Emir Kulacic, and the question is there, how can those anti-hierarchical thinkings be actively introduced in academia? So maybe can be answered both at the same time, because this is a question about deconstructing. And yeah, so thank you. I don't know who wants to start.
Maybe just the second question about academia starts to give us a clue for the first, in that we should recognize that the idea of the calling begins in architectural education. So there is this responsibility to tackle it there first and foremost, I suppose. And that's a question for other people in the audience and on the stage more so than I. But I think that's an additional responsibility next to what Elke's just mentioned in terms of what comes after, in terms of the product of architectural production, are the conditions in which architectural students and architectural workers made to kind of buy into this system of exploitation, the same ones that, I don't know, end up giving us these products of architectural labor that also are exploitative unto themselves. So that was a bit of an aside to say there's a long kind of line of consequences that come out of this. But I wouldn't be the first person to say that it has to start in architectural education. And I'm not even a good person to talk about it, because it wasn't my experience not being trained as an architect, but from friends and colleagues, it just seems, like you've got to break it right at the beginning. I mean, you asked the question, where do you go to study to become a feminist architectural worker? And I don't know that you would necessarily. Maybe you find another entry point in the chain of working towards the object, if we want to think of it that way. And you wouldn't have the problem of the calling in the first place if you did it that way.
I think the calling or the vocation is not unified. I mean, I think when we think about this also in a trans-historical way, you could say a lot of people claimed that they wanted to become architects in order to build a better world. And I think that is still very much part of the so-called calling. So what that better world looks like in historical retrospective, is another question. But then you could say maybe for a certain time it was also very appealing to become a star architect. And maybe at another time the so-called calling or vocation was filled with other desires. So I think we would need to deconstruct the specific appeal, how this vocation or calling was filled with certain politics of desires and attractions. And I don't think, so A, I think they are not unified at any given moment in time, and B, I think they also change tremendously over time. So I think one would need to start with that in order to understand what actually makes it attractive for people to study architecture in the first place. If they all know they will not find a job afterwards, they will all be exploited. Very few of them will actually run an office, and the ones that run an office will not define how they can run the office because the economy is so very present. So actually we could also think about what is the attraction of struggle in that. I mean, why are people attracted to this kind of struggle? And why do they want to fight these fights? And I think these questions are super interesting to discuss with students, but I think they also need to be discussed more openly once people have become architects, because I think it's not something that is actually openly spoken about. So everyone talks about their calling, but I don't know any architect who ever explained to me what their calling was. So I think it's interesting to understand what the calling is individually and like in a project of architectural consciousness raising for your feminist architectural workers.
And as much as I hate to now break up this discussion, it's already nearly 7:30. So maybe we can discuss afterwards, later on, outside of the podium. And
yeah, and we are saying thank you for the panelists. Thank you for the discussion. It was wonderful. Also for the whole day, for the others. And we would like to invite all of the participants of the Claiming Spaces Collective, but also of our guests who are today on stage, to come on to us and just
join us for a last round of thanking and greeting the public or something.
All for nothing.
Hi. Yeah, perfect. So thank you so much also to the RZW again and to you, Oliver, for the technique. And I think we have some drinks over there. Feel free to join in some discussion